Um, so I want to welcome everyone here. Thank you for being with us this evening or this morning or this afternoon, wherever you are. We have a very interesting lineup. Unfortunately, we have a last-minute cancellation and Tomer could not be here today. So what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce myself, which I should have introduced myself from the start. I'm Omer Shiloni Kabir. I'm a research student at the Federmann School of Public Policy and Government in Hebrew University. And I'm also a journalist for Calcalist, where I work with Tomer Ganon and the Calcalist team in covering the breaking news stories, the investigation about Pegasus. And I've been covering NSO and Pegasus for the last 5 years, quite constantly. And what we're going to do is I'm going to let David, and David and I are going to do a short talk about the Calcalist coverage, and then we're going to go to the forum with the panel members. And David has a few questions, and we want to give you some insights into the coverage in Calcalist.
Thank you very much, Omer, for being with us and organizing this event via the School of Public Policy and Maavrim program. And I'd like to start with the first question. Why Tomer's revelation scoop is so important? What is the meaning of all of it?
It's a good question. I think there's a basic meaning, which is the police is using surveillance software according to our coverage without sufficient warrants or without the relevant warrants, and sometimes even only with the post ex facto warrants, which is the basic story. But if we look at the bigger picture, we can see it's part of a problematic use by the Israeli police with powers given to it officially or unofficially. And here in Israel, those who follow it know that the police have been using for the last few years a system that a camera system that records license plates of cars in the street, and they've been using it without any sort of authorization, without even letting the public know it's being used. And only about a year ago, the Supreme Court said, well, you have to use it by law. You have to law to use it. And now the police is also asking the Knesset to approve her, to give her the power to set up facial recognition cameras in the street without sufficient supervision from the courts. And this use of Pegasus, again, according to our publication, Calcalist, without warrants, and also sometimes not in official investigation, just as part of information gathering efforts, is another indicator of this trend of police. And it's not only true to the Israeli police, but to other police units in the world that when they have access to technology, but when the regulator is behind on technology or is not aware of this technology use, there will be some misuse, even some abuse of this technology. And I think this is the most important, relevant part of our story.
So this is part of the surveillance society, much more than a particular software or particular organizations that is using its power without legal authorization, without the right regulatory authority. So would you say this is one indication for a much broader phenomena of surveillance and human rights abuse in Israel and more generally?
In Israel, but not just in Israel. I think you are correct when you said it. I think we've seen it around the world. Every time that a body that has some power over citizens is given access to technology, and that technology is not well regulated, there will be abuse. It can be major abuse, like we've seen in the UAE when the ruler of Dubai used Pegasus to spy on his ex-wife and her lawyers in Britain. or it could be more not so flagrant abuse, like what the police is doing here, but it's still abuse, and this is it is a problem, and we see it everywhere. The EU is trying to stay ahead of the curve and trying to regulate various aspects like AI and facial recognition cameras. But I think in general, regulators are behind the way even the agencies of the same country use the technology that needs to be regulated.
Yeah, surveillance society, and then there is surveillance economy and surveillance state. So the state and the companies are problematic in this regard, but also, and it's not only the only instrument which is problematic. But what is more probably concerning is the police response to the revelations. Can you expand on that, please?
Yes, so police response was, in my opinion, quite confused and at times aggressive. They started by saying, well, the story is just plain wrong, and then they said, and then they said, yes, it's true, but we have warrants. And then some journalists, not only us, noted that the warrants that they claim they are using, wiretap warrants, are not actually sufficient for this kind of surveillance. They changed the story, said they're using other type of warrant, which is also not sufficient. And if I may, I believe that the police representatives are not taking the story seriously enough. They are trying to dismiss it, to say there's nothing there, to say everything is all right, you should trust us, and not really, they are not really tuned to the various problematic aspects of the story that we write about. And I think there's also some sort of narrative that by publishing these stories, we are sabotaging the police work. We are preventing them from solving major crimes, preventing them from catching pedophiles. And our perception is that we are not against the police. We are actually on the side of the police, because I think everyone in Israel wants a good police force, wants a capable police force, wants a police force that can use technology to intercept communication from pedophiles and crime organizations. But we want this use to be regulated. We want to make sure it's not being abused. And we want to give the police tools to do it correctly. So we are and the police are on the same side. I think the police should realize that and be more open to the criticism we are publishing in our stories, and really do a thorough self-investigation of what's wrong in the way they use Pegasus.
I think what you say is correct, but the problem is not only what the police is doing, but also the response of the police doesn't respect the public and the revelations, and it doesn't show that they are taking it seriously enough. But it's not only a problem of the police. Your revelation in Calcalist open up a wide kind of outlook, or allow us to examine many regulatory failures in other institutions of the state. Can you expand on that, please?
Yes, so one of the problems that we see here is that the US Attorney General, according to the police, the surveillance of Pegasus was done, at least that's what they said at the start, later they didn't say that, was done with the approval of the Attorney General. And now the Attorney General is coming and examining the police use of the software, which is problematic when the regulator obviously probably failed or didn't do his job correct, and now he's part of the team that is commissioned to check this failure. Something here isn't working quite right. Yeah,
but this is also the Parliament and the Ministry of Justice.
Yes, the Attorney General is part of the Ministry of Justice, so yes.
And I cannot says that the Minister of Police or the internal security, or it was more convincing in his response. It seems that the government generally failed to understand what's going on and the seriousness of the trust crisis around it.
When you talk about the internal security minister, then yes, he almost immediately, like way too soon after the first story came out, fully adapted the narrative of the police that everything is okay and we checked everything and there's nothing wrong and everything is not correct in the story, or some parts or major parts are not correct. But there was today in the Knesset there was a pen, not a pen. One of the Knesset committee discussed this story, and you've seen something that really, really unusual. You see Knesset members from the left and from the right that usually don't agree about anything, all coming out and attacking the police and really outraged by our stories. And we never seen anything like that in the Knesset. So there are legislators that do understand the severity of the issue. And there are also some ministers like Eli Avidar who understand the severity of the issue. But those who are part of the establishment or are part of the system directly, for obvious reason, will try to protect it and preserve it.
A last question on the media side. You're part of Calcalist and you're part of the news media, and I wonder what did the story did for Calcalist beyond those, the kind of the prestige. It's a lot of attention to Calcalist, and of course it made a lot of good for Calcalist. But did you have to pay a price, or are you paying a price? Is Tomer paying a price?
Well, I wouldn't like to speak for Tomer on Tomer's behalf. I know he wouldn't like it, so I won't speak. But I think it's still too early to say. The story has been out. The first story has been out less than a week. So, and if there will be a price, I think it will come later. Right now, I think everyone is still trying to understand what is happening here, what are the implications, how severe it is. Not all the stories out yet. I think there will be more parts coming in next few days or something like that. So it's still too early to say if someone has been hurt. This sort of thing will only usually pan out over longer periods of time.
Thank you very much, Omer. I think we will reverse roles now, and you will take the leadership and introduce the panel and run the rest of the meeting. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, David, for your questions. And I would like now to introduce our panel members. So we have here with us, and I'm sorry about that. We have here with us Milton Mueller from School of Public Policy in Georgia Tech. And we have Dr. Bill Marczk. He's a senior research fellow at the Citizen Lab, University of Toronto. And Bill is actually one of the most famous, I think, one of the people who research NSO more than anyone else. Dr. Tehilla Shwartz Altshuler from the Israeli Democracy Institute. Dr. Dmitry Epstein from here at the Federmann School and also the Department of Communication at Hebrew University. Advocate Dana Yaffe, a clinical director of the Clinic of International Human Rights at Hebrew University. Advocate Itai Marczk, human rights lawyer and activist who filed actually several high-profile lawsuits against NSO, and we're going to talk about it later. And I really hope I'm saying it correctly. Sablot Shpanai, I hope I said it correctly, journalist from Direct36.hu and participant of the Pegasus project. And actually, I don't see Sablot right here. I hope he will join us soon. Okay, so Bill, I want to start with you because I think there's no one in the world that knows NSO and Pegasus more than you. And you've been covering human rights abuse by Pegasus in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia, in Bahrain, in other countries. And were you surprised to see this kind of abuse happening in a country like Israel, which is very different from countries like UAE or Bahrain?
Great question. Thanks for having me on the panel, Omer. So I think that my first reaction to seeing the story in Israel was not necessarily surprised that it had happened, but surprised that it had taken a while for this information to come out. Because I think that this tool and tools like it, so the Pegasus spyware and tools that are similarly stealthy and allow a broad spectrum of access to a target's private communications, those sorts of tools they easily invite this sort of abuse because they're very hard to oversee the operation of. It's difficult because the tool is designed to not be detected. The tool is designed to, quote unquote, not leave any trace or to be a ghost on the phone. So I think that these sorts of tools that give access to essentially your whole life, because if you think about the things that we do day to day, most of the stuff involves an electronic device, in many cases our phone. So getting access to the phone basically gets access to someone's whole life. So I think that because the tool is so powerful, and because you don't even need to have the target necessarily do anything, you can maybe in some cases automatically break into the phone with a so-called zero-click. That sort of tool invites this kind of abuse, and it's very easy for once the tool is up and running, it's very easy for the scope of the use of the tool to sort of subtly expand a little bit, especially if you have this model like the case that was revealed in Israel of this police SIGINT unit that was using the tool, and then high-ranking officials would sort of call them and say, do you have anything on this target? Do you have anything on that target? And that would sort of trigger the hacking. That sort of a setup, I think, is not really consistent with good surveillance oversight that we'd expect to see in a democracy. So I don't think I'm surprised. We've seen these cases of abuse in other democracies, and I think it's really part of this pattern where this sort of tool like Pegasus or similar tools can be an attractive way to dig up dirt on opponents, or to basically essentially have it can kind of, I think, push the government, or maybe pull the government a little bit more towards authoritarianism.
Okay, thank you, Bill. I want to open it up a bit and discuss the wider challenge of regulating this kind of surveillance software. And I want to start with you, Milton, because you have an interesting take about who we should be focusing when we talk about the regulation of surveillance software.
Right. So I think it's very important to begin this discussion by making a clear distinction between the domestic and the international environment. As we know, thanks to the work of Bill and others at Citizen Lab, NSO is an international scandal, right? Not just an Israeli scandal. Now, when you're dealing with a domestic polity, you can subject technology to define citizens' rights. You have a legal system, you have an authority that can impose those constitutional rights upon the actors. Now, there's actually a very well-known pattern that goes back a century in which a new technological capability is introduced and the nature of individual rights are unclear. So, for example, the very first wiretapping case in the US, wiretapping of phones was allowed without a warrant because, as far as our Constitution could tell, privacy rights meant seizing and searching property, and the telephone exchange was not on the citizen's premises, right? It was somewhere else. So they said, well, Sure, they can do that, but of course it took a fairly creative reconstruction of the right of privacy in the context of a new technology to implement the constitutional right of privacy. So once the new introduction of technology allows abuse, but once it has been detected, once the abuse has been detected, then you see a pattern of rights groups and citizens groups and democratic politicians acting to deal with those abuses. Now, when you get into the international arena, you're dealing with a completely different situation. Foreign citizens have no rights, right? We're dealing with not only an expansion of technological capability, you're dealing with literally an environment of anarchy in which anybody can do anything they want in the name of national security. So to answer your question, are you surprised? Am I surprised that Israel is doing this? Even though it's a democratic country, at least within the framework of how it defines citizenship, I'm not surprised at all. France was doing it. Dozens of other governments were doing it. Anybody who could get their hands on it, on this technology, was doing it, basically. And so how are we actually addressing this problem now? What kind of global authority do we have in this system of international anarchy to handle it? Well, the only thing we are doing is using the United States export control regime, which is our way of kind of leveraging our economic and technical dominance to impose conditions, certain conditions on other, the global economic system. And so we're doing economic damage essentially to the NSO group by imposing these export controls.
And is it really the only regulatory solution we can effectively use, relying on the US to regulate these companies for us, which obviously the US might have other interests beyond the interest that we are thinking about? Maybe they want to promote their own companies over in the expense of foreign companies. So are there really no other regulatory solutions?
Well, in the case of NSO, it's an Israeli company, so the Israeli government can, in fact, have some regulatory leverage. But if you're talking about a French company or a US company, yeah, there's really not a lot of options. Espionage is an anarchic environment. There's no international law even against espionage per se. And even if there were, international law is pretty weak, because who's the international government or the international police force that's going to impose the enforcement?
It's interesting that you said that for NSO, the Israeli government is the regulator, because I think Itai had quite an experience with the Israeli government regulatory willingness to regulate NSO, and maybe Itai would like to tell us about it a bit.
I think the best way to answer your question is to look who profits from the publication of Kalkalist. And I think there are two winners. And this is my opinion. I know that others think otherwise. The first one is NSO, because through the years there were other incidents in which the American government and others tried to blacklist Israeli defense companies or Israeli personnel. And the biggest battle of these people and company was to get the support of the Israeli government. And especially in the process that NSO is now, that it's been designated by the American government without any legal process. They don't have a clear way to appeal. The only way to cancel the judgment on them is by bringing the Israeli government to jump on board and to defend it. And while other Israelis, especially in the last years, had some difficulties to get the Israeli government support, after the Kalkalist publication, immediately all the Israeli authorities are jumping on board and saying NSO product, Pegasus, is a product that there's no replacement to. Like, this is the product that we need to have, even if we need to fix some problems. This is the solution. There's no other solution that could work to fulfill our needs to fight criminality or terror or whatever. And another winner is the Israeli police and Israeli law enforcement that for years, and probably Dr. Tehilla Altshuler could speak about it more, they have tried to enact legislation in the Knesset that will legalize all their surveillance tools. And our lesson from the legislation in Israel is that any legislation always include exceptions. And we don't have, we have a very weak possibility as a civil society to control these exceptions. And when we talk about the export policy, there's no different. What I could tell is that this main discussion now is about if the publication and the revelation by Kalkalis, if this incident happened with or without court orders. And my experience as an Israeli lawyer is that the courts give any order that the police and the security service want. The judges are not able to get into details. They are not familiar with technology. They are not able to do like a small court hearing about the technology. They don't have the professionality to do it, and they sign on everything. It's very rare that they disagree with the security authorities, especially if we talk about the wiretapping law, which give the authority to district court judges that plan to go to the High Court of Justice. So it's very difficult for them to go against the defense system. So I think from my experience on the defense export, I don't see any possibility to fix the problem by more regulation.
Okay, so I would love to hear your thoughts about what Itai just said. He said more regulation is not the solution. Do you agree with him? Do you disagree with him? If anyone wants to jump in, feel free. Milton, you're on mute.
Could I just ask regulation of whom, by whom, before I answer that question?
Itai?
And my position is that this kind of technologies like Pegasus, which are totalitarian systems, they should be banned totally. They should be banned for internal use, and they should be banned for export. Probably we missed the boat. The train already left the station, but I don't see a way to fix the problem with more regulation, because the temptation is too big to use it for political causes. The politicians are not waking in the morning and looking in the mirror and asking themselves, oh, how I will fight pedophile. No, they're asking themselves how they're going to keep their seat, to fight their opponents, and how they're going to strengthen their position. And the temptation to use this kind of system is too big. So I believe we should work as a coalition, worldwide coalition, to ban this kind of system and not to work on regulation. I actually am afraid that the regulation effort in Israel will cause huge damage in the international effort in other countries, because the world already copied Israel anti-terror law. There are many courts around the world that are using the Israeli High Court of Justice ruling that allow torture to legalize torture in their countries. So I think the regulation in Israel would cause global damage.
So the argument is that we need to ban the technology, not regulate it. But if you can't enforce regulation, how can you enforce a ban?
Well, nothing is easy, but I think this should be we should decide what should be the target, the discussion. And I think especially the last year after the Pegasus project, we learned that it doesn't matter if we talk about democracies or problematic democracies or a dictatorial regime or authoritarian regime. Everybody loves Pegasus. Everybody wants to use it. So this is my opinion on that.
Well, some of us don't love Pegasus, but the problem with a ban is that you have to define technologically what you're trying to ban. And I have looked at this question, and I'm pretty convinced that any attempt to ban certain things that you would define would end up catching in the net things that could be put to good use. In other words, this is a dual use technology, and a ban would overlap with things that would be number one, impossible to enforce, and number two, if you did try to enforce it, you might get into trouble. But that's all for me. Let's hear from others.
Tehilla, I know you always have something interesting to say.
Yeah, it's an interesting debate. My view is that while I don't think these sorts of technologies should be banned, I think that it's not hard to define what it is that should be the target of regulation here. I think a lot of efforts have been looking at the specific technology as the thing that should be regulated. But I think in this case, it's less about the precise technology and more, the technology is part of it, but it's more about the ecosystem that surrounds it. Like if you think about what these companies like NSO Group and Kangaroo and Quadream and others sell, what they're selling is, of course, the spyware product, but also they have a whole ecosystem of updates, of support attached to it. So if you sort of just give this technology to someone, maybe they'll figure out how to use it. Maybe it'll work for a little bit, but then it'll need an update to handle the new version of iOS or Android. And as we saw with the Pegasus spyware, and as revealed by the Pegasus project and follow-up investigations, there were these sorts of periods of time where NSO Group delivered these very powerful zero-click exploits, but then there was a patch, and then NSO needed to develop a new zero-click, and that requires updates and new versions of things delivered from the company to the client. So it's very much a back and forth, ongoing relationship between the company and the customer. And I think that's the really key differentiator here between companies like NSO and companies that just sort of sell spyware and exploits off the shelf. And so you might not need to define the target of the regulation as the specific technology itself, but rather these companies that provide these integrated surveillance solutions. In fact, we've seen the emergence of a term that you might have seen in the media recently, this notion of a mercenary spyware company, this effort to try and define the problem here by the company and the ecosystem rather than just the problematic technology. So that's my contribution to the debate. But overall, I think that this sort of technology, it is dual use. I mean, it does have uses in prosecuting crime, I think, just like more traditional surveillance tools. But there does need to be some sort of regulation, and regulation, not just defined in terms of policy, but also defined in terms of policy, not just policy that restrains the use of the technology, but policy that influences the design and the architecture and technical controls in the technology as well.
I want to do a short pass from talking about regulation and go over to Sablotch. Am I saying the name correctly?
Sablotch, almost correct.
Okay. It's not an easy name. And you've been listening very attentively to the conversation, and I think very attentively to Itai describe the situation from the regulatory and the court perspective in Israel. And I was wondering, you're in Hungary, you've been covering Pegasus and NSO as well. You've also been a target of Pegasus. Is the regulator and the court problem that Itai described, is it somewhat similar in Hungary and maybe in other countries that you covered?
Well, Hungary is in a very special position. Although it's a democracy, or people say it's a democracy, the problem is that we have a governing party having a two-thirds majority in parliament. So basically, they can pass any law they want, and their own comrades are leading all the so-called independent institutions. And one of the problems with the regulation here in Hungary is that when you want to surveil someone on grounds of national security, you suspect someone of being a spy or being in the orbit of a terrorist, etc., you don't need a permit from a judge. It's enough to get a permit from the Minister of Justice. So it's the executive power itself that permits surveillance in Hungary. And what the main problem here is that basically this is in violation of EU rules, EU regulations. The EU Court of Justice has already ruled back in 2016 or 17 that it's not acceptable, that there should be at least a judge overseeing the process of permitting surveillance, even when it comes to national security. But the Hungarian government did nothing to patch this flaw in the system, because of course it's in their interest to use this loophole and basically stamp any permit. Just as Aitai said, it's not better with judges. So in case there's a criminal investigation into pedophilia or drug dealing, etc., the surveillance must be approved by the judge. But in Hungary, we have, I guess, 2 judges for all of these cases, and they are stamping everything like robots. So I never heard about any permit that has been declined by a judge. So I think that the main problem here, and yeah, it's a big debate whether regulation or a ban is more effective. But I think that unless there is transparency, unless there is oversight, unless civil society or groups that have no attachment to the executive power, unless they don't have any say on permitting surveillances, I think there should be a ban. Because first, you just have to create an environment where you can trust your own authorities, and if it's not there, then you can regulate, but the regulators are themselves regulating their own people. So it's just a vicious circle.
I want to ask you another question. And a lot of the feedback we are hearing in Israel, well, I don't have anything to hide, I don't care. It's people with a lot of time when you talk about privacy, you hear, well, if you don't have anything to hide, you don't have to care about your privacy. And I want to maybe talk about your experience as someone who's been targeted by Pegasus, and explain how this affected your work as a journalist.
So, of course, as a journalist, I do have things that I want to hide, and they are called sources. These are people, these are brave people who give me information about corruption, about abuses of power. Some of these people are working for the government or working for state authorities. And as a journalist, I have the right to protect my sources. Unless there's an investigation involving my story, which could be punished with more than 5 years in jail. So unless it's a very serious crime, I have the right to protect and not reveal my sources during an investigation. So what Pegasus did to me, and what Pegasus did to at least 6 or 7 other journalists who have been targeted by this spyware, is that their right to protect their sources has been clearly infringed. So I think that's a huge problem. It's not just privacy, but it's also our right to protect our sources. And the other very troubling revelation here in Hungary is that we identified more than 10 lawyers who have also become targets of Pegasus. Among these lawyers is the head of the Hungarian Bar Association, so the most senior lawyer of the country. And just as journalists have their right, to protect their sources, lawyers have client attorney privilege. They are also obliged to keep the secrets that their clients are telling them. And this is a right that's embedded in our constitution, and that has also been infringed by Pegasus. So of course you can argue that if you're not a criminal, then you have nothing to hide. But the problem is that sometimes if you're a lawyer, your client is a criminal, and he also and you as a lawyer also has a right to protect that information that your client gives you.
Okay, I'm just gonna quick note that we're gonna go to the Q&A soon. So if you have any question you want to ask our panelists, please write them in the chat and we try to get to you. And I want to get to Tehilla because unfortunately Tehilla has been quiet until now, which is very bad because Tehilla has the most interesting takes and the most illuminating thoughts. And I want to hear your take on all the issues we'll be talking about up until now.
Okay, so thanks for having me tonight. And I've been researching privacy in Israel for a while now. And I always thought it would take an earthquake for a new privacy law to pass in the state of Israel. And I always thought it will happen when the National Biometric Database would get leaked. But maybe our privacy sensing holiday came this week, thanks to Tomer Ganon's exemplary journalistic work. I think that the public discourse in Israel is now busy thinking about the need to update the current legislative framework. And of course, there's the talk of the need for institutional safeguards. For example, how to prevent the courts from becoming a rubber stamp on requests for computer material search warrants. But let me ask you to imagine for a second. Imagine we enacted a new bill in a month's time, a brand new Digital Surveillance Act. What would happen within another month when a new technology appears? Maybe, I don't know, facial recognition system that can detect sexual orientation, or super sophisticated AI-based crime prediction product. We all know that there will always be a gap between technological advances and legislation. And since the beginning of the technological revolution, we have become addicted, I think, to an expensive interpretation maybe of laws, where we've been attempting to apply creative comparisons between current legal frameworks and perceptions and the new technologies that have arrived. I think that's a major part of the issue, because when there's a new technology that has no specific legal authorization, I think our first reaction shouldn't be, let's compare it to what we already know. It should be forbidden to use it. No interpretations and no comparisons. When there's no legislation, the Attorney General must not become the mini parliament or the mini Knesset, as we call it in Hebrew. I know everyone can say that the police would be left without tech abilities to catch criminals, and I say fantastic. The police is the best buddy to put pressure on the parliament to legislate and to regulate the use of new tools and technologies. Which leads me to another source of the matter, which Bill referred to before, the responsibility of our decision makers. And I'm not happy to say that, but most of the decision makers in Startup Nation are digitally illiterate. How can you legislate and supervise without knowing what a tool, let's say like Pegasus, means, how it works, what its capabilities are? And during the past couple of days, no one has been able to define exactly what Pegasus software is. Let me first use the following image as I try to explain to some of our parliament members. If a wiretap is like stealing a bread loaf from the supermarket, then Pegasus is like taking all the product from the shelves, as well as the shelves themselves, the employees, and the electronic registers. But that obviously isn't enough. What I want to ask here and put here on the table is the question, is Pegasus considered cyber collection, cyber reconnaissance, cyber surveillance? Is it conducting an information attack? Is it simply spyware? Or maybe we should refer to the euphemism cyber intelligence, as NSO described itself in its website, because this euphemism can actually be useful for our discussion, I think. This is because the methodology of intelligence operation is very, or should be very different from that of police investigation. And the cyber world and Pegasus within it creates a huge challenge here. Because how do you conduct intelligence in the secret services or in the military? Obviously, you're dealing with the enemy, so you do whatever you want. But I want to talk for a moment about the methodology here. Intelligence is done through a search within the black or a search within the dark. That is, by searching a huge file of general data, doing a broad review and detecting signs, looking for patterns, you know all about this. A police investigation requires a lead, and only from that lead is it allowed to proceed. So cyberspace in this sense has brought intelligent methods closer to those of police investigation. And the police claim the technologies are there, so why don't we use them? But the answer to that is because these technologies are not intended by their very definition for law enforcement. That's the question, that's the answer. It's not the nature of technology, it's the nature of methodology. And that I think has so far been absent from the debate. I think that's why also Professor David Kay, the Special Rapporteur on Privacy for the UN, ruled 2 years ago that tools such as Pegasus should be completely banned until a tightened framework for operating and monitoring them is established. This has to do with for internal uses as well. It's not only about exporting these technologies. And he called for a moratorium on their use. So it is, I think, precisely us who understand technology that should say aloud, demanding a ban on the use of a particular technology and also on a particular methodology until a stable framework for its operation is in place. That will not bring us back to the Stone Age. It will only make us more enlightened. And it will make my kids as well as yours more creative, free, and self-confident.
Dana, we emailed actually earlier, and you had a lot of interesting texts, and you had actually quite a few of them. I don't think we have time for all of them, so maybe you can just give us one or two.
Yeah, sure, I'll be happy to. So first of all, I think the phrasing of the question is very important because the police or the states like to tell us we have to choose between our privacy, and it's not just privacy, as everybody's been saying, it's also our right to freedom of information, of safety, equality. So whether we have to choose this right versus a right to life or to live in a functioning democracy, and I don't think this is the question. And we've seen what I was shocked about in your scope was the felonies that this weapon was used against. We saw cases of corruption and public order. And I think one of the reasons is that the police who used it, if they indeed used it, I don't know for myself, but if I read what you've published, I don't think they are aware to the damage that is in this tool. I think they're just used to it because they work independently all this time without having a public debate over it. And I think this is why this is very important to discuss what is the questions and what is the price we as a society willing to pay. I mean, NSO, it's a very hard case, but in a way, it's an easy case in the sense that it's a company that functions in Israel and wants to sell for democratic countries. But the question is wider. And we've seen just now in Israel in the previous 2 years, the government wants to apply these tools, or not Pegasus tools, but bulk surveillance tools for social insurance fraud and for car theft and felonies like this. So what I'm trying to say is that I think we first have to understand that the privacy violations is not something we can use all legislation for. And I think this is part of the fact that regulation is important, because if we leave this field unregulated, we'll end up with everybody using whatever technology they want, using some old authorization laws from the 90s. And this discussion should be broadened for all the authorizations the government wants to uphold on us. When I think specifically on this case in Pegasus, or the use of cyber surveillance methods like this, I think it was interesting to see that the police, and I believe they say truthfully, they thought they had the authorization to use this tool, and this is alarming. And for that reason, we have to have the conversation in the parliament and to tell them whether they have it or they don't have it. And this can only go through regulation. And banning the whole operation would leave this undecided. So this is my greatest fear. When we want to ban, as Milton said, we can't really ban it now, and we have to act and we have to decide how we want to proceed.
Dmitry, you have a very interesting, though somewhat complicated take on the issue, and I'm excited to see if you manage to distill it to a few minutes of conversation.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for this really fascinating discussion. I feel like I learned a lot already. As Omer said, that I am approaching this more from kind of a social science perspective, kind of to trying, and I'm just answering David's original question, right? Trying to understand the big picture, so what's at stake. And I do think that what we see in this particular instance is a symptom of a broader phenomenon. And even to start with, NSO revelations are not new. This conversation has been going worldwide since last June, but in Israel, right, it only hit home when there was something very domestic and very close to home, perhaps the same earthquake Tehilla was talking about, to start people think about privacy. The way I think about this, this whole kind of structure, right, as kind of three dualities. Like I'm thinking about technology design, technology regulation, and technology use. And I think we sort of touched upon technology regulation and technology use through this conversation, and also by one particular type of users. And there is potentially kind of a clash of schools of thought between levels of literacy and understanding between the regulators and technology. It seems that information technology regulation has always been reactive to developments in the field. And it seems to be that right now, like a lot of the conversations that I'm hearing are also very kind of focused and very reactive, whereas perhaps there is kind of a place to start thinking about this more broadly. And one of the aspects is indeed technology design. As I think Tehilla rightly said, or I think somebody else also mentioned, the level to regulate technology, you need to understand technology, and we're lacking this among decision makers oftentimes. But I also think that kind of the flip side of this are people who create this technology, right? NSO is not an agent of itself, it's people, it's business arm of the company. These are developers who build technology that kind of put certain affordances inside the tools, which are guided right, by worldview, which may be that of intelligence and not necessarily that of law enforcement. But just as we need more kind of technologically literate decision makers, we perhaps need more ethical kind of engineers working on these technological solutions. And this is not an immediate response to a single crisis, but more kind of a longer term, build up of I don't know, like kind of informed, opposition and demand from the public, right, to perhaps place boundaries around technologies of dual use, such as what, to my understanding, NSO is producing. I'll pause here because we don't have too much time, but I'm happy to jump in on some of the other points.
Yeah. So before we go to Q&A, I want to go around the panel one last time, and we talked a lot about challenges and difficulties and what isn't being done right. But I think maybe I would like to hear what can be done, what solutions we can apply even right now, and it can be about the exportation of cyber weapons in general, or the abuse of surveillance technology, like we've seen in the police here, and maybe we're gonna do it maybe in reverse order, if it's okay. Dima, do you want to start?
Yes, I have to chime in. I think given sort of the urgency, right, of the situation, and again, it's not urgent because of particular cases, but because we are in this sort of dynamic where the relationship between the citizens in the state has always been very asymmetrical, but it's growing increasingly asymmetrical with the addition of private players as kind of mediators of this relationship in terms of information collection and processing. To me, I'm not sure, I caught the last few minutes of the committee discussion today in the Knesset, And the calls to establish like an investigative committee included a comment from one of the people at the table, right, that it has to include technical people, in the mix of people who will be investigating it. And I think bringing in, again, like technical expertise into any type of regulation that we may want to consider for technologies like this, I think is the key. I don't want, given how many internet governance people are in the audience, I will not use the kind of the multi-stakeholderism as the term, but the idea is that like we need not just the legal side, the civil society representatives and the kind of the rule makers, but we also need the technical expertise at the table, even just to know what is possible and what is not possible in terms of placing limits on how this technology is used.
Dana?
Yeah, I think the first good start would be in transparency. And right now we have, there's no reason for court orders to be kept a secret forever. I mean, we know if they authorized or didn't authorize, but we don't know the details of the request and why it was authorized. And I think if people would know that in 5 years or 10 years time, the information they received and the order that they gave could be or will be published in with all the details, it will give a better incentive to give better supervision by the courts and by the police themselves. So as a first step, I would start with that. And then there are many amendments to be done, mainly with focusing of the exact felonies that such technology could be used against, and who would be the authoritative, but who would be the authorizing of the officer, and what's the role of the parliament. But assuming banning of this technology is not an option, transparency is a good first start.
Tehilla, I have a feeling that maybe Dana stole your talking points because you always like to talk about transparency. You're on mute.
Let me offer something different, slightly different. I think that the exemption that is given to the Israeli police from the Privacy Protection Act, which among other things prevents our adequacy with the GDPR, should be revoked. I think the police should get a legal duty to inform citizens that they've been surveilled. I think that after we've been seeing all the gatekeepers collapsing one after one, maybe private enforcement would be the solution here. If people could sue the police for unnecessarily invading their privacy, that might be a new dimension or a new direction for solution.
Szabolcs, would you like to jump in and have any thoughts about the possible solution?
Well, I'm a journalist, so I know little about regulation and how to solve that part of the problem. But former target of Pegasus is that what was really effective are three things. One is of course the journalistic work that this international group did, uncovering more cases, describing to the public each individual story, why someone was unlawfully surveilled. And I guess these stories on the long run will build up into political pressure through the constituencies, to people putting pressure on their own MPs to find a solution. Second is big tech. If you can convince big technological companies like Apple that it's a reputational risk for them if their product is used for surveillance, if they are sued, if there are lawsuits against these companies by former targets, I think then they will need to step up, and they will also need to use their lobbying power. So I think in this case, there is this unholy alliance possible with the big technological companies, because they are also not interested in what NSO and other spyware manufacturers are doing. And the third thing that seems to be very effective are US sanctions, since NSO group has been blacklisted by the US Department of Commerce, I think. Their financial dealings are heavily restricted, and their future is at risk right now. And I think the second step would be sanctioning the clients of NSO who abuse this technology, who violate human rights. And I think since the Ministry of Defense in Israel regards Pegasus a cyber weapon, if any kind of weapon is abused, then it's a crime against humanity. So I guess there needs to be a framework regulating and also punishing abuses with cyber weapons and treating it as crimes against humanity.
Itai, I know you said you think the only solution is a total ban. Are you still in that opinion after the discussion here?
Even more, because I think a lot of the things that were said are very generalized. Of course, we have hope for transparency and the things do work better, but like even if we talk about transparency, put on the side the issue of the story of Pegasus. A suspect don't have automatic right to get the investigation material. In Israel, there are very strict rules when a suspect could get the material from his investigation, like if you want to file an appeal. The police investigation unit are exempt from the freedom of information law. There's no transparency, and to change the transparency, there should be such a wild change of legislation, which is very difficult. What I would want to add is that I hope that the people, never mind if we'll be here in Israel and other places, that will speak about regulation, will think about people in other countries. Because like it was said, the Oscar is wide, also the discussion about regulation is very wide. Because we have to think what will be the meaning of it in Vietnam, in Rwanda, in Togo, in a lot of countries where the people over there and the victims and the academics are less on the table of making this discussion. In the case of Israel, when there is discussion about regulation, we should also remember that Israel is an occupied country, and what's the meaning of the authorities, the same authorities, the Shabak, the police, that will be able on one side of the green line to do whatever they want, on the other side of the green line to do other kind of regulation. So I think to think about this point, that regulation should not be only white. This is a good point to start for anybody that will want to work on it.
Bill?
Yeah, so one of the things that I want to draw attention to is looking at, for example, consider the U.S. Commerce Department designation of not only NSO Group, but remember they also designated another company in Israel's cyber industry, Kangaroo. And I think that this notion of the foreign designation, if we look at over the past year, let's say, of the various things that have happened. For example, we had the Pegasus project and other quote unquote naming and shaming efforts. We had the capture of NSO Group's zero-click exploit, which led Apple to do the lawsuit against NSO Group and the notification of targets. But I think that perhaps the most, or the thing that seems to register the most, at least in the media coverage of the response of NSO Group and other companies, is this US designation. That's what everything seems to be coming back to. Remember when there was the designation, there was the new incoming CEO of NSO Group. After the designation, he said, "I'm out. This is not what I signed up for." Yeah. Right. And so I think that and of course we've seen subsequent reporting saying, focusing on, okay, well, how is NSO Group going to fight the designation? How is Kangaroo going to fight the designation? Comparing the different strategies, and really centering and focusing on that as the number one threat to the companies, I guess, or at least the thing that seems to be capturing most of the attention of the companies. And I think that it's not necessarily just about the US. It's a pattern that could be replicated in other countries by other governments taking sort of actions to designate specific companies in the industry. And I think that the reason why I think that's something to look to as a model is because at the end of the day, this is a lot different. I think the regulatory question here is a lot different than focusing on like regulating weapons or something. The inherent usefulness or the inherent danger of a weapon is in the thing itself. Like if I have a gun, you can pull the trigger and shoots a bullet. You have a nuclear weapon, you can detonate it, and the very danger is inherent in the object itself. Whereas with tools like Pegasus, the actual physical thing, even the actual code is, it's useful for a little bit, but then you have to remember that the target is constantly moving. Phones are constantly being updated. Software is constantly changing. You give someone Pegasus today, it's useless in a month, right? Without any sort of updates and support and that ecosystem. So I think really targeting the ecosystem, targeting the companies that are providing these integrated services is the way I see forward with this regulation. And I think that the current model for this, the way that seems to be really registering on the radar of these companies is things like US designation and potentially, we've seen talk of other governments doing this, like in the UK or in the EU. And I think that's really I don't know, it seems to me to be like a very attractive way forward, just because it seems to be the thing in the past year that's had like the biggest impact on the industry and the companies.
Milton, your take.
Yeah, thank you, Bill, for kind of doing most of my work for me, because I was getting really upset at the way that this discussion was getting focused on technology and on banning it or designing it or regulating it, when in fact, this is about an actor. This is about a company, right? That is a bad actor. And the best and most effective way to regulate a bad actor is to specifically target the bad actor and not to chase what is in fact a chimera, that you're going to somehow control something called technology, which you can't even define. How would you define the technology that NSO is using when it changes every 3 months, and it's simply a different set of code in an internet network or affecting some applications? And sorry, Dmitry, but the idea that we're going to stop this by somehow controlling the design of technology, so you're even one step back from the technology, which is an undefinable concept, and you're going to say people are going to design things in an ethical and nice way. Well, maybe we can indeed get 98% of them to do that, but that 2% is going to be offered gigantic financial rewards by governments and authoritarian, dictators to do their dirty work for them, and frankly, they're going to do it. So you're not going to stop this through controlling design, even if that were possible, which it's not. The fundamental design of technology is unpredictable in its effects. You don't know what it will be used for down the road. You're not going to do it by banning something, because you can't define the thing that is to be banned. And if you try to do that, you're going to end up banning things you don't want to ban. But you can say, look, we're discovering ways in which this technology is abused by this particular actor, and you can go after that actor. And that's what's happening now. And as Bill indicated, that's what's being effective. They are being pushed to the brink of bankruptcy. They have lost their reputation. National governments around the world are backing away from them. Sort of like that famous scene in Casablanca where the guy says, "I'm shocked to see that gambling is going on here." And the guy comes up and goes, "Here's your winnings, sir." So when the French government says they're shocked that spying is going on here, and oh, by the way, we're not going to do any more deals with NSO, that's all very effective. But you have to be focused on a particular actor. You have to be, and you're not going to be able to predict in advance how technology can be used.
I can just chime in for just a tiny second. First, to clarify, I wasn't talking about regulating technology design, right? I was talking about, ethical engineers, right? Like basically this being another consideration that people will take into their plans as they do about them. But I would like to push back a little bit against the focus on an individual actor, because just as you explained right now, right, if you ban NSO, another actor will pop in. If you focus on a particular actor and you penalize that particular actor, another actor will come in, like according to the same logic, will come in and fill in the niche. Only will do it better and harder to kind of to define. So I think I actually think that NSO is less of an issue here as opposed to a broader trend of what we're getting used to and are willing to accept as normal in terms of surveillance in our relationship with our states. And we can, in this case, with our states. I'll stop here.
If I may.
I also would like to say a word.
Yeah, sure. Sure.
So I think Bill mentioned before the naming and shaming issue, and I really think it's the time to talk about the Mark of Cain. And the Mark of Cain, I don't necessarily mean, you know, the Israeli prime ministers who used Pegasus as a gift for friendship to dictatorships in Africa, or the head of the police who purchased this technology, or even regulators who approved the sales of such technology. I think we, as the civil society in Israel, should start looking at the consultants and the managers and the senior workers of NSO as people with some kind of a stain in their past. And if they represent themselves as people who work for the, let's say, commercial cyber industry, as one of their former consultant is trying to do now, then we need to start marking those people with this Mark of Cain. And I, as a mother, I would like the developers and the workers of NSO, when they go to their parents for Friday night dinner and being asked by their aunts, oh, what did you say? What are you working on at the moment? They wouldn't be able to say, I work for the high-tech industry, because there are different types of technology, and some of it is for the public good, and some of it isn't. That's it.
Okay. I want to take some questions from the audience here, and we have some questions in the chat. And if you have a question you want to add, you can write in the chat or direct message me in the chat, and I will try to get you. And first question from Ido Sivan Sevilla. I hope I'm pronouncing it right, Ido.
Yep, thanks, Omer. Thanks, everyone, for a wonderful discussion. It sounds to me like David likes to say that the state is the problem, but also the solution to some extent. But I have a technical question to Bill, and I'll be quick. So it's one thing for NSO to use zero-day exploits to get into your phone, but they need to get the info out of your phone to some extent. So why can't we theoretically monitor all the network out of your phone and spot the NSO signature and know that you are infected by Pegasus?
Great question. So the excuse me, the short answer is that is a great intuition, and it is possible to do that in some cases. So we published a report back in 2020 looking at the case of journalists at Al Jazeera who were hacked, and the way we established those cases was that a target was suspicious, they might be hacked in the future. So we began monitoring their internet traffic with a VPN, and we noticed the Pegasus signature a few months later and conducted an investigation. So it is possible in some cases. However, it is sort of like, when you're looking at the internet traffic of any device or any sort of amount of internet traffic, it's not always 100% easy to define like what is bad traffic versus good traffic when a lot of stuff is encrypted, especially when like we saw one of the details, I think, in the Pegasus project, which I don't know if it got a lot of media coverage, was that NSO was apparently using Amazon's service to do infection and data exfiltration. So if you look at something like that and you're like, okay, well, how do I, there's a lot of traffic from a device to Amazon's service. How do you pick out which is the NSO traffic and which is the non-NSO traffic? So there are some wrinkles and twists there. But one point that I will make more broadly is that this is very much an arms race between detecting this stuff and preventing it from being detected. And we come out or someone else comes out with a new detection technique or way to identify this, then there'll be a response from the company and other companies in the industry.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ido. Thank you for your question. Next question from Moya Barak. Moya? Moya, you want to ask your question? We can't hear you. Okay, so there appears to be some problem with Maria's mic. So if it's okay, I will ask the question for you. Yeah, okay. So who should lead creating a framework, especially where this is an international challenge? And could a relevant framework be achieved without bringing to the table law enforcement and the companies that supply the technology? Anyone would like to answer? Feel free.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but it sounds like it's pretty much the question is answering what's happening now, which is you have a collective action problem. If you're going to deal with this on an international basis, you have to get multiple governments to cooperate. And in effect, the US as sort of the world hegemon is the default basis for coordinating collective action, although Europe and some other regional organizations can also play that role. So yeah, you would need to, this is why I tried to distinguish very carefully between the international and the domestic implications of these policy issues. But if you talk about banning the technology, for example, that might actually work for some definition of the technology inside Israel, right? You could say in Israel, you can't do this. But getting that to happen everywhere in the world would require a cooperation among states, all of whom have a very strong self-interest in surveillance technology. And the human rights rationale for the US action and for some of the other countries is serving effectively as some kind of a coordinative norm, but you need leverage, and that leverage is coming from export controls.
Anyone else wants to answer Maria questions?
I would like just to note, oh, sorry, Dana, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I just want to say, I think the example of the US State Department and NSO is a good example for a strong player that dictates the rules. So in cyberspace, usually the US and the EU are the main players, and among them we can see how it goes or how it plays out.
Dima, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I'll just say, I'm not sure if I got the entire question, but I'm not necessarily convinced that law enforcement and intelligence agencies needs to be excluded from this discussion, just to make that point.
Okay. Next question from Idan Ring, from a colleague. Sorry, yes.
Just a quick note. There was this kind of an ongoing discussion, for example, between NSO and David Kay. Professor David Kay was the special rapporteur for privacy for the UN. They used to send him their ethical, periodically their ethical reviews, and he used to say back, you didn't say anything in those documents. But there was definitely cooperation and communication between the companies and the UN in this. That's
it. Thank you, Tehilla. Next question from Idan Ring, from a colleague of mine. Idan, how are you?
Hi, Omer. Good evening. Thank you for this really great panel. I learned a lot. I would like to ask Milton, but also the others, you talked about a bad actor, and there's a lot of focus about NSO. We've been speaking a lot about NSO because of the calculus revelations, but we know NSO is not alone, and there's a lot of other Israeli companies that also work in many places in Africa, in Asia, with the same kind of human rights issues, and also not only Israeli companies, also Italian companies, also French companies. So what do you think? There's only one bad actor, and how do we not know that other actors with the same technology will actually do the same kind of work? So maybe regulation is not the answer here, because even if we take down one company with all their financial issues, there will come another company that will provide the same technology or a different technology and do the same kind of work in places that don't really want to regulate, because like the Hungarian speaker said, in places like Hungary or even worse, regulation doesn't even work. So what about those places? How can we fix the problem there?
Yeah, first of all, I would have never said that NSO was the only bad actor. I mean, I'm deeply aware of the fact that there are plenty of them out there. The point, however, is that they were a major one, and there was a process of exposure, naming and shaming, which generated the political momentum for some kind of action. And essentially, I think it's unrealistic to think that anything more than that can happen with any of these other actors. That is to say, you know, we do know something about the Italian companies, and some pressure has been placed on them. You know, once you have like the Russian ransomware groups and hackers, you know, they're kind of exempt from a lot of the Western human rights pressure, precisely because their government is not cooperating with that international regime, and that's just a fact. I don't, you know, you have to do what you can, and insofar as what we can do is focused on a particular bad actor, then it will be effective. If you're trying to regulate technology, I don't see how you can, you know, if you don't think you can single out and destroy a single bad actor, how is it that you think you can single out and ban or completely regulate a technological system or an ecosystem?
There are other examples of technologies that, you know, you can see treaties, I don't know, against nuclear weapons or things like that. We have examples that are not very, very different. Maybe the same could happen here.
But in those cases, you can identify what the technology is. You can say, this is a nuclear weapon. And even there, you know, you have problems with Iran or North Korea. So I'm just being realistic. You know, I'm not saying this is the optimal solution. I'm saying in a system of international anarchy, let's focus on what you can do and have realistic ideas about what creates the demand for this, which is the anarchy among states, and what can we actually do about that is realistically effective.
Thank you.
Thank you, Idan. I really appreciate it.
Can I
yes.
add quickly?
Yes.
Sometimes the regulation goes both ways. As we've seen in the States, there was the famous act with Apple that goes all the way to the Supreme Court against the FBI. They didn't want to permit their customer privacy being infringed. So maybe we should think in the line of what Tehilla said about regulating, like a co-regulation between the companies and the states. If we can have, if there will be good enough incentives for the workers in the companies not to work with certain states that violate their own terms, this might be a solution. And we are working in a very under hard constraints. Yeah, it's not, there's no good answers because it's a real problem, but it's just a thought. Maybe these incentives for the companies might help us regulate the states to regulate the companies.
Thank you.
Yeah. I have a preliminary problem with the definition of bad actor, because when we are talking about Israeli companies, you cannot say NSO is bad actor. You have to say that the Ministry of Defense that gave the license to NSO is a bad actor. And all these companies, even though some of their knowledge and technology was being on their own, all the building of the company was only allowed by the Ministry of Defense to decide to designate this company to go and to get its export license. And also the designation by the American government is connected to the relationship between the Biden administration and the Israeli administration. There's a big possibility that if the administration is changed, we will see the designation of NSO being canceled, like we saw in the past with the designation on sanction on Dan Gettler and other Israelis. So it's, I think, also to talk about the actor, it's not a perfect solution.
Okay. Thank you very much, Idan, and thank you for the panel members for answering. And we have just a few minutes, so I'm wondering maybe if one of the panel members have a question for one of the other panel members. It will be if you want to ask. No. Okay. So I think we can sign off here. I want to thank everybody who've been with us today, all the audience that stayed up this late, at least in Israel. And I want to thank the panel members, Milton, Bill, Tehilla, Dima, Dana, Itai, and Sabolch. I hope I said it correctly this time. And I also want to thank David for helping me organize this event. And I hope you had an informative and enjoyable evening. And thank you very much for being with us.
And thank you, Omer, for putting it all together so efficiently.
Thank you.
And thanks for a masterpiece investigative journalism project. Took place
This is, I will take your words to Tomer Ganon, which is really all his excellent and amazing work.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.